very much. So for those that may have joined a little bit later, my name is Max McCardle. I'll be running today's webinar today. It'll all be about vulnerable road users, which is a space I'm very passionate about and do lots of work within. So I'll be today's webinar host. First thing that we did want to get stuck into, though, is the previous assignments. We had some awesome submissions, and lots of those assignments are being graded at the moment. So you may have received feedback, or it may still be coming. But would anybody be brave enough to pop up their hand or enter in the chat? And if you'd like to share your site and just share some of your findings from your assignment number 2. Anyone interested in being our little guinea pig? Guarantee you'll get a prize, and it might be a good prize. Be a special one.
Absolutely. Now, there are a couple of Safe System Solutions staff in the course, so if we don't get a volunteer, I might have to volunteer one of them. Hold on, Henry, you've saved them. Oh, and Anita. Oh, great, we might do 2. All right, I'm going to jump in with Henry.
Good morning, Henry. How are you? You should be able to unmute yourself now. Still having technical difficulties.
It's okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Thank you, Henry.
Good. The intersection I've chosen, Kathy and Max, was Olsen and Southport Nerang Road. It's a fairly big intersection down here on the Gold Coast. It's got fairly long approaches. There's pedestrians utilizing that intersections as well as cyclists. There's a few things that can potentially be addressed regarding safe systems or safe system, speeds, potentially separating pedestrians and cyclists from through traffic. There's also a concrete barrier being installed on the, I think it's the east or westbound approach towards the intersection, that's got a concrete barrier installed, and which might potentially inhibit some side distance or have some side distance issues at that location. And yeah, that was my intersection. Sorry, I've jumped the gun and just kept on talking, but
no, that's fine. I like your enthusiasm. So this is a massive intersection you've got here.
yeah, it's got about 60,000 annual average daily traffic, which is quite substantial for the Gold Coast. So it's a well-utilized intersection.
Fabulous. So you mentioned there the 60,000 vehicles traveling through there.
16,000.
In terms of safe system, the way that we do our scoring, we separate things into exposure, likelihood, or severity. Which of those metrics do you think the 16,000 volumes would fit in there, Henry?
Well, potentially all of them. There's, in terms of exposure, it's got a high volume of vehicles traveling through there. It's a 4-legged intersection, and there's also 4 slip lanes being provided with some zebra crossings for pedestrians. So exposure is definitely there in terms of exposing pedestrians and cyclists as well. There's long approach lanes, especially on Olsen Avenue, which might potentially have a few speed issues associated with that, especially if you're coming from the east towards that intersection on Southport Nerang Road. There's a fairly high number of conflict points, as there should be with, or as there will be with the signalized intersection. As I mentioned, the speeds approaching this can be high. There might be some sightline issues for the left-turning vehicles out of Olsen. You'll see them approaching there from, on your screen, from the northern side, from Olsen Avenue, turning right there. And then that's the likelihood. But when it comes to severity, I think crash impacts speeds here might be an issue. And then there's a large amount of infrastructure as well at this intersection. Obviously, signals, signage, there's some advertisement, lamp poles, electrical, but also that concrete barrier on Olsen Avenue is also might be a potential hazard.
So there's a concrete barrier on the northern leg.
Yep.
I just dropped a little fellow down here, and we'll see how things look on the ground. Oh wow. Okay. Yep.
We've just got a note from Anthony saying that Google Maps aerial is well out of date. Road was upgraded a few years ago, so Street View might look a bit different, but yeah.
Okay.
I travel this fairly often, so it's very similar to what it currently looks like.
Okay.
Yep.
But so the first thing that you noted there was your high traffic volumes, and I think you correctly identified that as relating to exposure. So I completely agree with that. You also made reference to the fact that, you know, we've got these zebra crossings, we've got some bicycle lanes, so we are expecting vulnerable road users within this area as well. So something else to consider if you were to be conducting a safe system assessment within this area. Now, this concrete barrier, this one is interesting. I wouldn't say it's a typical feature, but in terms of, once again, the way that we split up our safe system assessment scoring, exposure, likelihood or severity, which of those kind of categories do you think installing this concrete barrier has perhaps helped to mitigate?
Well, severity for sure, by installing that end barrier or crash barrier section there, that's definitely bringing down the severity. The likelihood is potentially still there, although it's a fairly uniform or linear approach coming from the north. But people making the right turn out of Southport Nerang Road, approaching from the east, are still exposed to that crash barrier or that crash cushion. Likelihood as well, potentially, but I would think severity has been well addressed with that crash cushion or that end treatment.
Yes, spot on. I completely agree with that assessment. Interesting thing. Oh, we're inside the shop now. That's a bit weird.
I wasn't there.
Interesting thing with these barriers, particularly when they're installed in these urban environments, and you can see that the offset from the traffic lane there's not much there.
Yeah, that's right.
You could actually argue that there's an increase in the likelihood of run-off road crashes. So if you had, say, a wider median, either a painted median or curb and channel with concrete infill or something like that.
Agree.
The risk of running off road and striking something would be less because you've got more chance to correct your movement, get back into your lane. But putting these physical obstruction in there close to the edge of the traffic lane actually increases the risk of run off road. But as you correctly pointed out, the severity is certainly going to be impacted because you'd much prefer to collide with this concrete barrier than onto oncoming traffic, basically. So that's definitely well noticed. A few other things that have caught my eye with this particular site, Henry, is we've got two right turn lanes, which has a few kind of, I suppose, road safety concerns or issues or risks associated with it. One of them being, it's quite common when you've got two right turn lanes adjacent to each other to have like side swipe type of crashes whilst turning. So potentially think of a heavy vehicle that's turning right there and may need to cut into the lane, and another vehicle not, understanding that requirement. So
unless that phasing has provided for separate or separated right turn movements there, and not
okay. Well, that's good to know. Yep. The other, what can also happen, which I think Ken may have already touched on, is this idea of a dynamic visual obstruction or masking. So if a vehicle was turning right in the inside or on the outside of this right turn lane, so this one here, and say a pedestrian was crossing over, perhaps illegally or they're outside of their phase, this right turn vehicle would block the sight lines of the other right turn vehicle. So potentially this vehicle would see a pedestrian crossing and stop, whereas this vehicle may continue through. So there's that dynamic visual obstruction in these cases. Probably not a massive risk, given that it's signalized, and a pedestrian crossing there would likely just wait until they got their phase. But certainly something that kind of comes up whenever you do have multiple turn lanes.
Yep.
Do you know if this, on the southeast quadrant, is this a shared path for cyclists as well?
I didn't have a specific look, but I would assume that cyclists will be able to use that as well.
Yeah, it looks like it is shared path.
Yep,
Okay.
it is.
Yeah. So once again, that would just indicate that you're expecting, you know, higher than average cyclists populations through here, which would once again increase your exposure levels. So we've talked about quite a few risks at this intersection, but Henry, I'm interested to hear if you've actually thought what we could do if you were looking at this through a safe system lens. What could we do with this intersection to better align it with safe system principles?
Well, I think first of all, to potentially separate your cyclists from the traffic lanes, if at all possible. I know you're probably restricted in terms of the boundaries there and not having enough space to do that. But if you can completely separate cyclists from that intersection, you've got a cycle lane approaching from the south as well. That's on road from the other side. Yep. So there's a cycle lane approaching there. So if you can potentially separate your cyclists out of or remove them from that conflict with vehicles completely, that's a potential approach. Maybe provide raised platforms on the slip lanes to slow vehicles down and make them a bit aware of the potential conflict there with pedestrians and cyclists. And I don't want to say provide a flexible median barrier on Olsen to replace the concrete, but that might potentially remove some of that risk, which will widen your shoulder to some extent and also provide more visibility for vehicles turning right there, as well as pedestrians approaching from the west.
Wonderful. So lots of great suggestions there. I'm completely on board with off-road facilities for cyclists. Let's get them away from this busy intersection and, you know, provide a treatment for them so they don't have to mix with general traffic or away from them. That's fabulous. Also great to hear you've thought about these slip lane crossing points. And if we were able to raise all of those up, it reduces both the likelihood of a crash there occurring and also the severity. So here in Vic, we call those wombat crossings, or here in Australia, sorry. And it would be fabulous to see those installed at each of those legs. The other suggestion was, you know, raise intersections. So actually bringing down vehicle speeds as they enter the intersection. So if a collision were to occur, ideally you'd get vehicle speeds at or below the 50 km/h mark, because that's when that risk of a fatality just really starts to get starts to exceed the tolerable forces. Forgetting the word here, Kathy. It just goes out of control on the graph, basically. Exponentially increases. There we go. I got that. So yeah, you want to try and bring the speeds there down to that, and raised intersections or raised safety platforms on the approaches is an excellent way to do that. So this is a very complicated site, Henry, and you've done a brilliant job to analyze all the different risks.
Awesome. Thanks, Max.
Thanks for putting up your hand. Definitely a prize coming your way. And
awesome. Just a quick question, Max. You'll see there on the northern, there's a trailer easy rentals with an access location there that's in that slip lane, just as you go out of that slip lane. So just around the corner there. And if you go through this.
Yep.
So there's an entrance there or an access point there that might be a bit of a challenge for cyclists as well, close to that bus stop. Don't know really what you can do there. It looks like they've upgraded this a little bit though, although it's still in the merge lane on Southport Nerang Road. So people that's trying to merge there, that's looking over their shoulder for traveling east, looking at cars potentially traveling from the west, might not see pedestrians there, or
and you can
might
see
be some.
They've popped these pedestrian crossing and a zebra crossing on this footpath here, but not for this footpath here, which is very interesting.
Yep.
I think it'd be as you were saying before, if we had an off-road cycling facility, if we had one,
Yes.
perhaps this footpath was widened a little bit and we could make this a cycling connection and then remove the need for this on-road bicycle lane. That could be an option there, but yeah, there's a lot going on at this site. So lots of little intricacies and complexities, but I completely agree that this access point would need to be considered as part of your safe system assessment. So not just looking at how the intersection works, but how other different accesses and even considering things like sight lines at this access point and, how pedestrians would be able to sight vehicles exiting there and all those types of details. So brilliant work. Thanks very much, Henry.
Thanks, Max.
No worries. And Kathy, should we hop into another site, or do you think get stuck into the webinar?
Actually, we've got a question that's come up.
Yeah.
If the right turn movements, so when you're having a look at this intersection, are designed for the design vehicles in such a way that there is no side swipe, would it still be a safe system issue?
Great question. So if it is designed that, whatever the design vehicle is or whatever the expected, longest, heaviest vehicle to go through there is completely catered for, is there still a risk of side swipe crashes occurring? I would say yes, because there's still the risk that the driver makes an error and doesn't acknowledge, where their turn lane is meant to end, and they perhaps go through there too quickly and they require more space, therefore resulting in a side swipe. So certainly if you've done all your swept path checks and it's all got the ticks from that perspective and it all looks good on paper, you've reduced the risk, you've reduced that as a likelihood. However, it still does exist as a risk. But very good question.
Thank you. Okay, and we probably could do another one, do a speed version if
I'm happy to do one, that'd be great.
Yeah, okay. And Anita, you popped your hand down? Maybe you thought you lost your chance, but you still got a chance if you would like to do yours.
Hi there.
Hi, Anita.
Hello, Anita. How are you?
I'm good.
That's good to hear.
So
another Queensland one, isn't it?
This is very different to the previous example. So
okay,
this
great.
is
Terrific.
Westmar. If you Google Westmar, it's a small town, if you want to call it that. Past Dalby, MAR.
Yep.
I've popped it into the chat, Max.
Oh, that's very.
Is it Mooney Highway?
Yes.
Yes, great. Yeah. You go straight into Street View, Max.
Oh, here we go. Does this look right, Anita?
I'm still waiting.
You got to share.
Oh,
Screen. Yeah.
My screen's not sharing. That might help.
There we go. So our problem here is vehicles not stopping at the crossroad.
Okay.
And as you can see, it's just long and straight. It's long and straight.
Yeah.
It's long and straight.
Yeah.
Approaching from the north, heading south, you can't really see the intersection. It just kind of looks like it keeps going.
Yeah.
So we need to. It's pretty old on the sides.
Yeah.
The street view. Yeah. So there's no visual cues to know that there's a crossing coming up.
Yeah.
There's like your standard little crossroad sign, but the truckies have been driving for about 45 minutes in a straight line. They probably don't pick up on a little crossroad sign, which is the standard treatment. So the main problem is that approaching from the north, and I thought you could put in a speed hump to alert them something's going on and slow them down to, it is regulatory 60 there, but we've had people drive straight through. But I thought another simple option that we could put in was if you go back to the aerial view, there's an existing rest area there on the left.
Yep.
We could just close the intersection on and make it a T and divert all the traffic around that corner, because it's already built. All we have to do is line marking.
Yeah.
And it would really slow them down. And then you could put up a decent kind of sight boards or visual cues at the T to stop people driving through.
Wonderful.
So they were my suggestions at that intersection.
Thank you, Anita. So the risk that you've raised, we refer to this as a see-through effect, which is pretty self-explanatory. But as you're saying, dead straight road and things like just, having this line marking here, and then that line marking is in the exact same line, like it just feels like it continues through. And I'll just double check on the ground if there's any utility poles going north-south. There may be. But even following like the overhead wires, because that all carries through, that also does something with our eyes, that just like, this is the road that goes through. So I completely agree with you. This is just a textbook example of that see-through effect risk.
And they're really not very alert on both legs.
Yeah. So the suggestion of a speed hump or a raised platform or something like that, some type of haptic, and haptic just means like, you can feel it in your hands if you go over there, that kind of acknowledgement would certainly reduce the risk of going through there and not expecting to see an intersection. Probably smaller interventions you could look at things like splitter islands, just I suppose a bit more cost effective. Other things that we do quite a bit here in Victoria, things like rumble strips on approach. So once again, they just provide a little bit of a physical warning that you're approaching an intersection.
An alert.
Yeah, and you can also do things like flashing signs. So as soon as it registers that there's a vehicle approaching, the signs will start flashing to say, hey, there's an intersection coming. But all of those ideas pale in comparison to what you suggested. If we can actually divert traffic through here, and the thing that I really like about this suggestion is that forces motorists to slow down. So even if they were at this point going to head straight through the intersection, well, they're going to be doing it at a very low speed for starters. So I think that's really clever. You probably have a lot of kickback, because then they have to turn right and then go left if they wanted to continue their journey, which may frustrate the driving community. But in terms of safe system principles, that's really good thinking, Anita. So thank you for sharing that.
We've got just a question. What are the traffic?
I'd be interested to, only about 150 on the side road and probably 400 on the highway, but they're both state roads.
Oh, right. Both state roads. Okay. And so you had a question, Anita?
There's nothing else around. Like there's nowhere you can divert to.
Yeah.
For about, if you had to go around the intersection, you'd be about 150 k's diversion. There's that few roads. With regards to having a speed hump in advance of the intersection to slow people down, I'd be interested to know how far back. Like, do you slow them down when they're, coming in at 100 so that they are slow by the time they get to the intersection? Or do you have it I don't know if at the intersection's too late?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So the way a good resource that you can actually use within this space is compact roundabouts. So I believe that we've shared that on our learning management system. If not, I'll be sure to send it over. But it's obviously got to do with roundabouts, but it's got the similar philosophy of using vertical deflection on approach to the intersection. And the way that it's kind of recommended is further back, you'd put in a raised platform or the speed hump, as you were saying, but you'd bring that speed down to like, an 80 kilometre, 70 kilometre range. So it's not like a jolt that's going to, destabilize vehicles basically. So you'd gradually slow vehicles down 200 meters away, and then bring them back down to grade level. And then as they're coming to the intersection, you'd bring them down to another speed of 40 or 50 kilometers per hour as they're going through here. In terms of this site, just due to its remote nature, it's not one I'd probably recommend, just the level of infrastructure required, like it's millions of dollars to install those types of things. And the number of vehicles going through there probably wouldn't warrant it. But in terms of the thinking, that's bang on, Anita. So yeah, you could potentially have you could have as many different ramps as you want, like gradually slowing down as they approach the intersection. Awesome.
We have lots of these kinds of intersections with the drive-through problems. So it's good to get lots of different ideas just to see what we can afford at which intersection.
Yeah. So the splitter islands are probably the most common. You can also just like stagger the T a little bit. So if you just shifted this across just a little bit, just even, 10, 15, 20 meters, just so it's not straight through for the driver's eyesight, they have to kind of do this dog leg turn. But anyway, I think you covered that perfectly, Anita. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you, Henry. Yeah, definitely Queensland represent. True story, Anthony. And we had some other comments in there about what about an offset intersection. So I think that's what you were just talking about there, Max.
Yeah.
And Nicholas has come through with rumble bars on the minor approaches, 35k per approach. Sorted.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nicholas. Is the presentation shared now?
It certainly is. Good job,
I might
Max.
get stuck into the content.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you again for sharing, and keep questions and comments coming through, and I'll let you get into it, Max.
Wonderful. So today, as mentioned, we will be chatting all about our vulnerable road users. So that is pedestrians. It's basically anyone that's not in a metal cage, so not in a truck or a general car. So pedestrians, cyclists, motorcyclists are still considered vulnerable road users. People in wheelchairs or mobility devices, they all fit within this category. This is just a reminder here to record, but we've already started that. Just a brief reminder of how we define risk or how we calculate risk within the safe system methodology. So it is the multiplication of exposure, which is our traffic volumes, our likelihood, and our severity. The exact calculation will become more evident in next module where you go through the safe system assessment framework, but it's just good to continuing to reiterate exposure, likelihood, and severity and how they relate to different treatments. So we will remember an exposure is all about trying to treat the number of road users within that space. So if we are closing down a road, we've reduced that conflict there between, in this instance, a train and a vehicle. So we've eliminated that exposure. So this one is an example of exposure. If we have a segregated bike path, a little bit difficult to see in this little photograph here, but you can see there's a bike path down here and all the general traffic are up here on this overpass motorway area. But you can see we're not making cyclists ride up adjacent a traffic lane or anything like that. They're completely separated. They've got their own path. This is an example of exposure because there's really no way for a cyclist and a vehicle to conflict with each other. Yeah, so this is just another example of that exposure thing. Road user exposure refers to what numbers of road users are actually using that section of road that you're looking at, and thus the risk of being exposed to a crash. So when we think of exposure, always think about your AADT or your annual average daily traffic. So the number of vehicles heading through there. When you're thinking about vulnerable road users, well, think about how many motorcyclists would you have in there? How many cyclists? How many pedestrians? We generally have pretty good metrics for the first one for our traffic volumes, or we could make pretty reasonable estimates. When it comes to things like knowing motorcyclists or cyclists or pedestrians, there is a bit more of assuming to be done, but there's some tricks to do that with the safe system assessment framework, which we'll get into. We've also got this slide here, which just spells out some of our fact sheets to do with safe system assessments, because the safe system assessment framework has a degree of subjectivity, and it was developed 5, 6 years ago, I'm going to say. And, you know, now that we've started applying it to different projects, there's kind of common questions that keep cropping up. So we've produced these fact sheets, which are included in the learning management system, basically just saying the best way to, you know, if you do run into particular issues, if you were doing a safe system assessment, well, the fact sheets have likely covered off those issues, but just a really handy reference for you to keep going forward. So that should be already in your pack. Today's session, we are going to be talking about movement and place, particularly within the safe system thinking. We'll be identifying key characteristics for vulnerable road users, and things that particularly work well for you know, our pedestrians and cyclists and motorcyclists, things that align highly with safe system principles, and importantly, we'll always be referring to whether the treatment would impact exposure, likelihood, or severity. So we'll get stuck into it. Movement and place is a road classification framework that has been adopted by several jurisdictions. I believe it actually started in the UK. It's called Lincoln Place over there. I'm not sure if they were the first one, but they certainly influenced Australia's adoption of it. Basically just acknowledging that our carriageways, our road network has two distinct purposes, one of which is the movement of people. So we've certainly got to consider that as an aspect of our road environment. But the x-axis is perhaps less considered, but the road environment also serves a place function. And by place, we mean it's somewhere where the community actually, you know, they hold a certain value to it. They enjoy being there. They want to be there. So take it as an example, a high place value would be a main street, which has lots of, you know, shopping or eating districts, or could be by a beachside along the esplanade or things like that. So although there is a road network there, there's lots of people that actually want to congregate there. They want to spend time there. They want to meet their friends there, etc. So that's how the place falls into this category. We've got a safe system snippet on this topic if you are interested in this, but it's been kind of well adopted in various jurisdictions now. The one that we're showing you in this slide is actually from New South Wales. So Transport for New South Wales, they use this particular matrix. There's different jurisdictions obviously have slight tweaks because we like to do everything differently depending which state you're in. But I think this one does a pretty good job of explaining exactly what the movement in place purpose is. And one thing to note straight off the bat that we do like about the New South Wales version is within the movement in place classification, you can see there's this separate box here, which is just for motorways. So those are our roads where basically all we want is movement. We don't want any place value there. So you can see it's kind of, it's shifted across before the place value starts, suggesting that we don't want people to, you know, stop here, get out of their cars, enjoy this area. This is solely for the purpose of moving goods, moving people and goods. So that's why it gets its own classification. The other four we've got here are movement corridors, vibrant streets, places for people, local streets. As mentioned, different jurisdictions would have different ways to group all of these items up, but it's more or less the same philosophy. We will hop into exactly what those different categories mean in the next couple of slides. So Our first one we've got is places for people. If we think about safe system, and we've got vulnerable people and they are exposed within this area, what we would like to see is we want to make sure that vehicle traffic volumes are low. So we don't want to see a main thoroughfare through here. And we also want to ensure that traffic speeds are very low as well. Because if we've nominated this as places for people, we've said, okay, the movement of this category is not the critical factor, but what we do need to cater for is the placemaking, or, you know, how do we make this street desirable for people to stop and dwell and enjoy? So lots of planter boxes, you know, wide footpaths, but even this is, you know, you're not even sure, is this a footpath or is this a roadway? And that kind of ambiguity is actually quite good because it ensures that motorists aren't traveling through there and using that as a through traffic route. So some really interesting things going on in this example. If we have a look at, we've got a few different before and after, I suppose, renditions of artistic impressions of different road environments. So we'll get started with one, and I'll get you to pop in the chat. Say this is at our existing conditions of a road that is, you know, could be a local street or it could be along a main street or something like that. Current speed here is 40 kilometers per hour. If we wanted to make this, move this into the category of places for people, what type of infrastructure interventions could we apply to make this a more people-friendly space? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to have a flick through and jot down some ideas in the chat.
And pop in an E, an L, or an S if your suggestion impacts exposure.
Thank you, Kathy. Yes,
that's all right. That's what I'm here for, Max. That's what I'm here for.
If you could, extra points, if you, when you pop down your treatment intervention, if you want to put in brackets E, meaning that intervention relates to exposure, or an L, meaning it relates to likelihood, or S, it relates to severity. So like to see, and it could relate to all three. So feel free to just pop them down in the chat as well, just so we can see how well aligned everyone's thinking is. Anyway, I'll give you a couple minutes there.
Yeah, it's good to see everyone's sharing it with everyone as well, which is great because you can build on other people's ideas. Or good.
Am I speaking loudly, Kathy, or is it, you can hear me okay?
Certainly can, Max. I would have let you know otherwise.
All right, lots of awesome answers coming through. Thank you very much for all these suggestions. And it's really positive to see that we are getting lots and lots of correctly assigned exposure, likelihood, or severity. You may hear me say that a million more times before today's webinar ends because it is so inextricably linked to the Safe System Assessment Framework. All right, a few of the ones, I'm not going to be able to go through all of these, but a few of the ones that stuck out to me designating this as a shared zone. So rather than say that, you know, pedestrians are forced just within this narrow area here and over the road as well, maybe we can do things like curb extensions or planter boxes and things like that to narrow the roadway, but make it a shared area as well. So physically slowing down our road network there, which I think is a great idea. In terms of that resulting in a speed reduction, where we've got the speed reduction, that would influence both our likelihood of a crash. If we're going slower, we've got an ability to see a kid that jumps out in the middle of the road. Also influences our severity. If a crash were to occur, it would be less severe. So the idea of a shared zone and speed reduction, very good suggestions. You can see in this artist's image, it's not a particularly inviting area for, you know, a place for people. It's you just look at the cross section of this area and, you know, how much of that has been dedicated to general traffic. It's, you know, the overwhelming majority. So it's being favored for mechanical means as opposed to, you know, what we would find inherently attractive, which is, you know, wide footpaths and nature and things like that. So that kind of high level thinking is actually also related to the safe system thinking, because if we can include treatments that will communicate to drivers that this isn't just a road network, that, you know, they're entering a new space, perhaps with threshold treatments or, you know, even colored surfacing or things like that, just really indicates to drivers that this is a new space and it's not just solely for your travel through here. Okay, got to get through a few more of these. All right, so speed calming or speed humps, reducing the severity. I agree with that. Making this a one-way street, that's a good idea as well. Would that impact exposure likelihood or severity? A one-way street, in terms of the way that, because the exposure is all about your traffic volumes, if you were to create a one-way street, I'm just going to try and draw over this picture. I'm not sure how well this will work, but if this was actually like a block, this is not going to work out well. This is why I don't usually do drawings, Kathy. But say this was a block here and this was, you know, a two-way currently. If you were to just make it one way, you'd need to double check to, you know, what would the traffic modeling suggest how much your traffic volumes are reduced, because you may still have the exact same demand going through there just in that one direction because they've got nowhere else to go. So there's potentially that the one-way street may not impact exposure all that much, or you're pushing, you know, risks into other parts of the network. So there's a few things to consider there, but as a general principle, I do agree with this. We'll have a quick look to see.
Sorry, yes, I was just going to jump in there. Phil's saying one way would affect exposure because it would discourage some traffic, but you've just talked about that there.
Yeah.
Anthony was made a comment about shared zones can get in the bin, so I was intrigued and found out a bit more about that, and he's commented that shared zones discriminate against people who have low or no vision or are neurodiverse. The environment should be obvious for all people.
Yeah, right. Okay. So I certainly agree. There's lots of examples of poorly designed shared zones. So we basically want to do as much as we can as designers for a shared zone not to look like a road. So we want to make sure that vehicles are kind of like, am I allowed to be here? And giving the priority at all locations within that shared zone to pedestrians, vulnerable road users accessing there. So yeah, I wouldn't go as far as like a blanket. There's never been a good shared zone installed, but happy to have that debate. I've got an artistic impression of how the places for people could look within this environment. And there's lots of those suggestions that have actually already come through. So one of them is, you may have noticed the speed has come down. It's now at 10 kilometers an hour because we've created a shared street environment. Probably would have noticed also the much wider footpaths, introduction of landscaping. One thing that kind of catches my eye in this artistic impression, and just remember that it is, you know, just meant to be a high level suggestion. But if you were to create a shared street, you don't really need this. It's a little bit difficult to see, but there's a zebra crossing there. If it were to be a shared street or a shared zone, pedestrians should be encouraged to cross at all locations, as opposed to you can only cross here. So that's something that I would encourage to remove within this particular design. But that is just, yeah, it's lots of ideas that you all came up with, and it's been included within this artistic rendition. So well done, everyone. Kathy, any questions?
Thanks, Max. Yeah, look, there's different schools of thought here, and yeah, I guess again, Anthony's suggesting the fundamental problem with shared zone is it's a carriageway is not a pathway, it's a hazard to cross. So people have a right to know when they are on and off the carriageway of the hazard. But I guess the flip side is that vehicle speed is so low, or the people in driving the cars don't know if they should be there or not, and maybe feel a bit uncomfortable themselves. So they're traveling at a speed that allows everybody to share the one space.
Yes, I agree. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Max. Thanks, Anthony. It's good to have these discussions, because we get to share everyone's ideas and experiences.
So I'm missing a slide here. This one doesn't seem to have any picture there, Kathy. That's
You've
all
just
right.
gone straight to the artistic impression, haven't you?
There's no picture on this slide though, but anyway, we'll have a look at, this is a different environment. This is more like a main street and an artistic impression of finding, I'll just flip back to our matrix here. Probably fits more within our vibrant streets category, where you do have a movement function. So it's important to get, you know, general traffic. It could be a bus route, for instance. It's important to manage that, but also it's acknowledged that people actually want to, you know, spend time there. Perfect example of this is any of your high streets within metropolitan areas, where, you know, you could have your nightlife along this particular road, but at the same time, the road connects to freeways, or, you know, connects to outer suburbs or things like that. So it has an arterial function of moving people as well. So classified in this matrix as vibrant streets. Pretty challenging area to be able to manage, because you're trying to cater for a lot of different users all within the same space. What they've opted for within this particular artistic rendition is, well, we will give motorists, in this instance, the buses, we'll give them separated bus lane facilities. We'll also give separated cycle facilities and separated footpath here as well. So this one is the idea of, you know, if you've got all these competing, conflicting road user groups all using the same areas, you've got to make some decisions as to, you know, what is the best way to be able to, you know, hopefully cater for everyone. But if not, how do we prioritize movements within this area? And this example just shows that, okay, well, it's a place for people, so we need to make sure that pedestrians have got a safe place to be able to access the adjacent network, as well as all the shops and things like that. Cyclists can safely travel through here through the provision of a separated bicycle facility. And for general traffic, well, we're actually going to prioritize the buses within this route. So we're going to prioritize public transport in this particular instance. So It does look like general traffic may be further down along this road, but just the indication of the red lanes here suggests that they're trying to spruik this as a public transport lanes as opposed to just general traffic. So this one is quite transformational, which probably wouldn't suit, every single road network. As I said, these vibrant streets are probably the most difficult classification, because no matter which option you go with, you will be upsetting one road user group or one aspect of the community. So this really does come back to, how do we want our cities to look? How do our strategic plans tie into this specific location? And, if this has been nominated as active transport is critical through here, then that should help with your debate to get protected bicycle lanes and separated footpaths and things like that. Conversely, if this is nominated as, we absolutely must get traffic pushed through here during peak periods because, it's the most critical route within this city, then that would also influence how this design looks. But we're just trying to tie into this idea that movement in place and safe system thinking, whilst they are two different frameworks, there's certainly an overlap between them, and they can support each other. So the idea of separating cyclists, obviously that's going to reduce the likelihood of a vehicle striking a cyclist because they've got this protected curb and channel in between them and the traffic lane, or the bus lane in this instance. So lots of that overlapping thinking. When we look at local streets, now this is referred to as residential streets, probably more commonly known as, but it generally has a low movement and a low place function. And it may upset some residents along that street to consider that their street is low place value. But when we're talking about the movement and place matrix, we're thinking about places, at a macro level. So, across the state or across the jurisdiction. So your local street is probably not as important as, a CBD area where there's lots of, museums and pedestrian generators and things like that. So think of residential streets within this space where, you're not expecting large amounts of traffic to be going through there, and you're not expecting a great amount of, tourist or pedestrian desire to be traveling through there. And this is a perfect example of where we can get, things like wombat crossings, raised pedestrian crossing points installed within these areas. So example here. So this actually gives priority to pedestrians crossing over here. And we love to see, whenever you're doing priority pedestrian crossings, we love to see them raised up. So creating a wombat crossing. The reason is, if you just did an at-grade pedestrian crossing, so if this wasn't raised and the zebra markings were just at grade, drivers still have a bit of confusion as to what that means and that they need to slow down for pedestrians and give way. They still kind of treat the road as their road, and if there's nothing there to slow them down, then they won't. So if we instead install a wombat crossing and we raise this feature, we are clearly communicating to motorists that this is a priority pedestrian zone, and we are forcing motorists to slow down because we've introduced a speed hump. We've introduced that vertical deflection, so motorists are forced to slow down. Another really good benefit of this, doing a wombat crossing, is you've got the footpath level being maintained all the way across here. So for people in wheelchairs or mobility scooters or things like that, it's just easier for them to be able to cross the road now because they don't have to go down to road level, then back up to footpath level. It's all just one consistent level. So lots of benefits for our wombat crossings. And in terms of our safe system thinking, we say that this impacts likelihood and severity. I've got another artistic rendition now of an existing conditions. And once again, I'll get you to jot down in the chat And please, in brackets, add E, L, or S, exposure, likelihood, or severity. What would you do within this local street, which is currently at 40 kilometers per hour? What could we do to help improve this, to make it more amenable and to create it in that local street classification? So we want to make it a little bit friendlier for residents living along here as opposed to what we're seeing here. So please pop in the chat any treatment suggestions you can think of here to create this local street or redesign this local street. I'll give you 3 minutes for this one.
Would this be a good time for a quick break as well, Max? Maybe we'll go 4 minutes?
We'll go 4 minutes. So, yep, back at 11:04. I've got.
Terrific. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathy. A few that's caught my eye. So I just wanted to clarify, our exposure is all about our number of road users. So number of traffic volume or number of pedestrians, number of cyclists. So interventions such as widening the footpath or, creating a bicycle lane or things like that, it wouldn't reduce, traffic volume numbers, or it wouldn't reduce cyclist or pedestrian numbers. So we wouldn't say that those things influence exposure. You could argue if you had a bicycle park there, you may increase the number of cyclists, but that's perhaps getting a bit technical. So yeah, we want to make sure that when we're identifying treatments as relating to exposure, they're definitely impacting the number of road users within that area. So a perfect example of exposure for this site was if you just closed it to cars. If you just said, no, there's no cars allowed in here, that would impact exposure. Okay, lots of good ideas. So widening footpaths for pedestrians, absolutely. Curb out stands. So yeah, once again, widening the footpaths or creating some kind of horizontal deflection. So motorists don't just have one straight line to go through, but have to slow down to navigate these areas. Narrowing traffic lanes, absolutely. It is quite a wide environment at the moment. Wombat crossings, and great to see that that has been noted as likelihood and severity for that treatment. So well done to Melanie. Sina's put in 4 perfect ones: wider pedestrians, bicycle lanes, raised zebra crossings or wombats, and signage and zebra crossing at every intersection. So lots of excellent connectivity through there. And Phil as well made the suggestion of a high pedestrian activity area, HPAA, which is used in New South Wales. Could be done in other jurisdictions. I think it might be in Queensland as well, but we don't do those here in Vic or Tas. Basically just a sign with, pedestrians crossing or holding hands, I believe it is, and then a 30 kilometre per hour speed sign as well, to reiterate why you're slowing down or because there's people there. So it's a high pedestrian activity area. Well done, Phil. I'll show you the artistic rendition of how this one looked, and much more lovely environment if this was your residential street. And I would encourage you, maybe after today's session, if you just drop your street view on a suburb or a town in the Netherlands, it probably looks something like this. This is basically how they design their local streets. This is what it looks like. So it's not wide enough to be able to cater for 2 traffic movements all the time. You basically have to slow down and give way to each other. There's little indented parking bays here and there, but it's not guaranteed for every property. And it really pushes back, that's why they're able to, cycle in the middle of the road, for instance, like this, because the traffic that is heading through there, they're in such a constrained environment that they're traveling slowly, and it's acknowledged that they do not just own this network, it's a shared space. So that's what's been provided in this example, and a little fun exercise if you wanted to follow up on that after today's session. But just one example. So we can see, obviously, we've got the narrow traffic lanes, we've got, bicycle hoops to encourage active transport, got a 20 kilometre per hour speed limit as opposed to the 40 that was there before. Just a much more, much improved amenity in this environment. Our next classification that we were going to was the vibrant street. So I think this slide should have been there before. Yeah, okay. So I don't know how this got moved around, Kathy, but we'll follow up this after the presentation, so apologies. But the one that we looked at before was an environment that was similar to this. And we can still do this exercise. So we'll make this the last artistic rendition exercise, but this is, you know, a classic example of how an arterial road network has previously been designed, where we've basically just got lane after lane after lane, just keep adding another lane until, you know, hopefully the congestion issue disappears. But what do you think we could do within this example here to create a more vibrant street? So we want to make sure that pedestrians are able to access both sides of the carriageway. We want to make sure cyclists have got ability to, you know, stop and enjoy these lovely, you know, bars and restaurants and shops and, you know, fish and chips and things like that. They've got ability to stop and dwell there. If you don't just add in any thoughts about what we could do within this particular cross section, that'd be excellent. But yeah, if we could just add one more lane, that's certainly been the priority of previous governments.
What would one more lane be? Exposure, likelihood, or severity? Would it be?
Good question. Yeah. So we'd be increasing our exposure because presumably we'd be getting more traffic volumes through there. So that's going to negatively impact our road safety. But you can see at the moment, you know, we've got cyclists that keep going, draw on the other screen. We've got cyclists just riding on road, so mingling with traffic. The speed is 70 kilometers per hour. So we don't really want to encourage cyclists riding on road, particularly in the traffic lane at those high speeds. So there's another cyclist there. The pedestrian walkway, the overpass as well, is actually an interesting one because it was all the rage back in the day. Well, we've got a main arterial road, so let's just build a walkway so we get pedestrians up and over and away from the traffic. And theoretically, great thinking. Safe system, tick. Yep. What we've done is we've reduced the exposure because we've got pedestrians crossing well away from where the general traffic is. So there's no interactions, no conflicts between there. So on paper, big tick, makes a lot of sense. In practice, people may not use the walkway. It may not be their desire line. It may be inconvenient to climb up the stairs and then climb down the stairs. This is an example where it doesn't look like there's a lift either. So people in wheelchairs or mobility devices may not be able to access that facility at all. So it's something to really consider if you were to be installing, you know, these overhead structures. How attractive are they to the users? Or would we get this kind of thing happening where pedestrians just cross in a way that's convenient for them, which could be at grade and, you know, trying to push their way through all those traffic lanes to get to the other side. So certainly sounds good on paper to have these elevated walkways, but they should be carefully considered. All right, I'll just go through a couple of the comments that we've come through here. So lowering the speed limit, absolutely agree with that. Designated lanes for bike and bus, introduce at-grade crossing points. And from Anita, separate bike paths, remove pedestrians. Wow, interesting. Install overhead walkway. So we've got the overhead walkway there, but if you're suggesting perhaps, you know, a DDA compliance overhead walkway or something that's a bit more attractive, then yep, I hear what you're saying. We'll have a look at how the artist has reconfigured this environment. So very similar ideas to what we heard there. We've certainly got our protected bicycle lane that's provided. This is referred to as a bi-directional protected bicycle lane. So you can travel in both directions. It's not just one side of the carriageway. And then we also have a bus lane, which is given there in the red there. We've got the speed reductions here. So we've nominated for a 40 km/h speed limits within the centralised area, and I suppose on little laneways, which I think are these little side streets here, 10 kilometres. So that's a big speed reduction there. But you can see it's fairly obvious, but you know, going from this stressful environment, not very attractive as a pedestrian. You wouldn't really want to spend too much time going through there, as opposed to an environment like this with much wider footpath facilities and landscaping, things like that, much improved amenity and a much safer outcome for our vulnerable road users. So that's the last artistic rendition that we've got, but I've got a few more slides to get through. I'll just check in with Kathy to double check I haven't missed any questions or comments.
No, travelling well. Thank you, Max.
Fabulous. Okay. Now, when we do get to the intersection, I'm just going to grab a sip of water. Particularly for cyclist facilities, we need to consider exactly how we manage those conflicts, because it's often been a case of just good luck if you're a cyclist. So we've got this example here of what is called a protected intersection, which is used very commonly in European nations, in the Netherlands and in Denmark, and they're being implemented in Australia, they're being implemented in the United States as well, and Canada. So we're starting to see them pop up more and more and more. But the significant feature of these particular intersections is these kind of curb islands or curb outstands provided at each quadrant of the intersection. So at each corner, it's difficult to see, but you've got them at each corner. And their purpose is to actually provide an offset from traffic lanes. So a car there turning left and a cyclist heading through here. They provide this offset between the two. And that's really critical, because generally our intersections have the bicycle lane right next to the traffic lane with no offset whatsoever. It's just a white line and then you just travel through. And that puts the cyclists in a precarious position because they're within the passenger side of a vehicle. So that left turning vehicle has a tough time to be able to actually see a cyclist in a traditional intersection. But in this environment, what we actually have is when the motorist is at this point here, about to cross over the bicycle lane, this island kind of forces them to take, you know, a more sweeping, sorry, a tighter radius curve, which means they're actually looking towards the bicycle lane as they cross. So they're much more likely to be able to see cyclists that are crossing. So if you haven't seen the protected intersections before, this is a really good way of treating signalized intersections where you do have cyclists, bicycle lanes on approach. So happy to provide some examples of those if you are interested. We've also got, this is an example, another example of a bi-directional facility. This one looks like it's in Sydney to me. And just another example of, you know, if this were to be coming up to an intersection, how exactly is that going to be managed? Is that just going to head straight through, or is that going to have a little bypass similar to that protected intersection? You can see that there is a degree of protection from our traffic lane with those little bluestone picture curbs that have been installed there. So, and you can also see if you've got very good eyesight, which I've only just noticed now, but it actually looks like it raises up at this point. It looks like there's a little hump here. And I would suggest it's likely to do with bringing cyclists up at grade with pedestrians. Maybe when they're crossing here, there could be a mall district there or something like that. But bringing cyclists up onto the same level as footpath users and providing another degree of separation from general traffic there. Might be going on in that photo. Yes, so our movement corridors is the last classification to touch on. And these where we're really saying, you know what, doesn't have much placemaking value. We don't really want people to spend time here, or, you know, crossing the carriageway isn't the most critical feature of this. but the movement of traffic really is. So these are, generally quite higher speed environments, 60, 70, 80 kilometre per hour. You can see multiple traffic lanes in this example. Where there are crossing points, generally they're signalised. It's not a zebra crossing. You wouldn't want to be putting a zebra crossing across these multiple lanes, because that could have that visual dynamic obstruction effect or the masking effects. So actually having the prioritised crossing via signals for pedestrians. You could also look at installing, where those crossing points are, if you were to raise the surface at those locations to provide vulnerable road users extra safety crossing over there. But in saying that, as this has been identified as a movement corridor, the key focus here is pushing vehicles through, and it's not necessarily for, people to stop and dwell and congregate and things like that. So yeah, it's just a way of, viewing the road network and trying to identify treatments that would suit that particular classification, because we need to consider exactly, what would be appropriate as a treatment for the specific road uses within that environment. This is actually an example of a movement corridor. So this road here takes, I'm going to say about 15,000, 20,000 vehicles a day. It's huge. It's a really busy intersection in Melbourne. And even despite that it has that significant arterial function, it still has a raised intersection. So as you're traveling here, as you approach the intersection, you've got a raised section. You've got that raised section there that slows you down to 50 kilometers per hour. So if a collision were to occur, hopefully you're traveling at or below 50 kilometers per hour, which would reduce your severity of the crash. So just wanted to reiterate that although this has been identified as a movement corridor, and that's its primary function, there is still, vertical deflection that has been applied to this road to reduce the risk of crashes at this intersection. And it's also been applied at our little pedestrian crossing point here on the slip lane too, because we're acknowledging that our vulnerable road users are particularly vulnerable in these instances. So we need to, ensure that speeds are managed where they have conflicting points as well, which ties in perfectly with my next slide, but I'll check in with Kathy to see how we're doing.
Thank you, Max. So I've got a question about bike lanes, and I think you're about to jump into people who ride and people who walk and people who motorbike.
Mm-hmm.
So for bi-directional bike lanes, how do you rate the trade-off between space, efficiency in layout versus compromised accessibility for riders?
Great question. So the way I actually run a cycling infrastructure training course, and I get into quite a bit of detail about this topic because it's quite a pertinent question. So basically, yeah, if you've got a bi-directional cycling facility, you may just have cycling facilities that's on one side of the carriageway, and that may be completely appropriate if one side of the carriageway is a university, a train station, the museum, the cafes, etc. The other side of the carriageway is paddocks or residential, or it's not as critical to have that connection on both sides. That's really where I think the bi-directional facilities work brilliantly, where it's got that strategic use just on one side of the carriageway. If you have constant crossover, if it's a high street, for instance, and cyclists do want to be able to cross over at both sides of the road, they want to visit that shop and that shop and that shop, then that's when you may have bicycle one way here, bicycle one way here, either side of the carriageway. So I don't think it's a one size fits all. You can't, definitively say this is, what's appropriate in all of these cases. It just needs to be evaluated depending on your particular site. But yeah, some people hate bi-directional, for instance, but I think it's wonderful, and there's lots of great examples of them being installed.
Terrific. Thank you.
Oh, is that it?
Oh, yeah.
I thought there was another one coming. Very good. All right. We'll hop into our cyclists and pedestrians. So generally seen as our most vulnerable within all of our road users, because we, as we're walking across or cycling across, we don't have that metal cage to protect us. It's just us. So very vulnerable. The severe injury risk. So a 10% chance of a severe injury to occurs at just around the 20 km/h mark. So you may remember from previous modules where we had that exponential risk increase. It's actually at the 30 km/h mark, because that is the risk curve associated with fatal crashes. So generally, we take it as a 30 km/h. That's sometimes referred to as the safe system speed. And so, yeah, people may rightly argue that, well, why aren't we aiming for the 20? Because that's where severe injuries are occurring. And the fact of the matter is we're so far away from even getting 30 km/h, like rather than try and set the bar all the way up into the heavens, we should try and hit this state first before we try and make things, too unachievable, I suppose. So anyway, you generally see vulnerable road users and the speed associated with their crash threshold at 30 km/h. The young and the old are even more vulnerable. Young as their bodies are still developing, and also as they're smaller, so they're more difficult to see. The old as their bodies are perhaps more weathered and more prone to injury. They can also be slower to cross the road and things like that. So we generally just have this little caveat here. We like to manage speeds to 20 km/h if possible, where pedestrian volumes are significant. Otherwise, we want to seek to separate the road users. So it's quite a overarching aspiration, but once again, it is difficult to be able to provide that separation at all locations, because pedestrians will always just want to cross wherever it's convenient for them. But in terms of some separated treatments, you're probably seeing these starting to pop up. They're getting more popular. These they're referred to as Copenhagen treatments. And basically it pushes a bicycle lane adjacent the curb line and moves the parking lane out. So traditionally it'd be the other way around. You'd have a parking lane right against the curb, and then you'd have the bicycle lane adjacent the parking lane, meaning they're within that dooring zone. The Copenhagen lane flips that ideology. So, you just reduce that as a risk of dooring, and also reduce the risk of an errant vehicle in a traffic lane colliding with a cyclist too. So perfect example of reducing the likelihood of a crash occurring are these Copenhagen treatments. These ones are they're very popular once again in the Netherlands. These are referred to as a protected roundabout. There's a couple in Queensland I'm aware of. There's a couple in Melbourne, and there's a few in New Zealand. So it's the idea of, rather than make cyclists join the carriageway and the circulating area and mix with general traffic to perform their left or through or right turn movements, let's get them off road. So you're providing this facility here, and let's get them crossing in a prioritized fashion. So it kind of flips the thinking a lot. In the past, traditionally, it's kind of accepted that roundabouts do an excellent job for reducing the risk of general traffic crashes, because the angles are better and your sight lines are better and things like that. It doesn't offer that same benefit for pedestrians and cyclists, a traditional roundabout. Whereas these protected roundabout designs, that's their express purpose, to be able to improve the level of safety for pedestrians and cyclists. So this is just an example of, or a markup of, Moray Street in South Melbourne. This has actually been installed now, but just to show how a movement works, it's starting at the bottom of the screen, and a cyclist that wanted to turn right would have this type of movement. So it works like that. And yeah, vehicles, you know, they have to stop and wait here and give way. You can see there's a little give way sign there for cyclists that are crossing there, and may already start ringing alarm bells for some of you that have done any traffic modeling or experienced level of service congestion issues. That would this treatment affect, you know, level of service and congestion? And the answer is yes, it does. But this particular project, the design objective was to improve the level of safety for cyclists. It was actually, you know, it's being used as a project to attract more cyclists and to get them away from an alternative route. So we're saying, cyclists, we want you over here on this route here. So they just say, you know, our priority really is for cycling safety. So if that comes at the cost of general traffic can't move through here as freely, so be it. And that's the stance that this council has taken. And when they do get community feedback or complaints that they're, you know, no longer able to get around their local area quite as freely within the community, within this particular area, their response is simply, well, we've prioritized this for active transport. We encourage you to, you know, to get on your bike, basically. Perhaps more eloquently phrased, but that is basically the philosophy that they've gone with. Kathy.
I quite like get on your bike. Okay, so some questions here. I think, thank you, Hugh, who's answered Sina's question earlier. So you guys just doing my job for me. So do cyclists give way to pedestrians here?
Yeah, good pickup. They do, and it's a bit of a subtle design thing, but can you see the zebra crossing at this leg? It's at the upper legs as well. It extends over the bicycle path. So it indicates to cyclists, this is still a pedestrian crossing point that crosses over your path. So you need to slow down and give way to cyclists there. So yes, pedestrians have priority. Let's give a prize to that one. That was a really good question.
Okay, great. Will do. And a prize for Hugh for answering the questions. Phil says, stuff the modelling obsession. These roundabouts should be the standard installation. Nicholas says it really cuts down speed and volumes and parking, which attracts cyclists, and there's now more cyclist versus pedestrian near misses. Give way at the roundabout at the exit. Doesn't that compromise capacity of the roundabout?
Yes, it certainly does. So the question there, well, if this vehicle's, you know, propped in this location or maybe sticking out a little bit and giving way, and you're potentially getting this blocking effect of the roundabout. Yeah, just back to that level of service and congestion. If you've identified this as an area to prioritise active transport, then I suppose that's the main objective of the project, and that's what you should be selling. And it may come with, you know, these different detractors, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the level of service for cycling and walking isn't. Is there no level of service for those modes? Sorry, this is my own question. There is. Okay.
Why don't you check that with Ken?
Yeah, good idea.
In terms of movement in place, I know that there's actual metrics to suggest what their level of service is, but
tell us, how do volumes and parking decrease? Are they seeking alternate routes to avoid this roundabout?
Yes. So the general traffic that used to use this as a bit of a thoroughfare or a rat run, they're now shifted to the arterial, which is, you know, the way that we want our road networks to operate. So yes, it has reduced traffic volumes.
Right.
And parking as well. Parking has actually been maintained along these streets.
Tell us about how you answer the question. Pedestrian crossings installed too close to the roundabout increases the likelihood of rear-end collisions.
Understand, yes. I understand this in principle. So if we've got, you know, we're getting too close to the roundabout, so that's the crossing point there. Well, you may have a vehicle A that props and blocks the crossing point. In this particular site, there was enough width to be able to provide one propped vehicle space there to be able to be clear of the crossing point, but acknowledge not all sites have that luxury. And where that is the case, there is a risk of a rear end or a collision with people on the path itself. You know, if they're trying to get around, they may collide with a vehicle that's coming from the rear. What I'd say is a few things. If the feature is raised, you've already certainly done a good job of managing speed. So rear end collisions generally have very low severity, particularly if you're in these urban environments and you've got this raised feature. So it's unlikely to result in a serious injury. So that's one good thing in terms of the safe system thinking. The other thing I was going to mention, which I have slipped my mind completely. I had a 2-point summary there, Kathy, but it's
Sorry
gone.
about that. I'm detracted. Might come back to you.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, yeah, your rear end collisions far less severe.
Yeah, far less severe.
Than,
Oh yeah, and that's what I was going to mention. It just came to me then. Yeah. Once again, if you were to look at, well, if we can't do it because of rear end collisions, we have to build a traditional roundabout. If you looked at that as a risk and said that means cyclists are riding within the circulating area, and that means they are subject to traveling within the traffic lane at speeds greater than 30 kilometers per hour. If a crash were to occur there, it's likely to be a fatal or serious. So if you were to weigh up, well, what are the different crash severities to occur in these different states that you're reviewing? I'd still be leaning towards a rear end crash.
Yeah, and I think it must have been channeling you. Rear end collision at a crossing point may save the life of the person walking across who would have been hit by the car that did the rear ending if the car in front hadn't been there. But I think we're all on board with that.
Much more eloquently worded as well. Thank you, Phil. I'll give out a prize to Phil there, Kathy.
Oh, very good. Okay, we've got about let's say 20 minutes max. And I did also want to highlight a couple of things in the learning management system that I've added from the last session. So
fabulous. I'll get
not to give you the wind up music, but
I'll get on my bike.
Boom boom. Thank you.
Here is Moray Street installed, just so you've got a bit of an idea of how this looks like. So the raised facility there, and we use these funny little signs to say give way to cyclists, just as a supplementary plate, just to cover off that it's not just a zebra crossing, it's not just for pedestrians, it's also cyclists crossing there as well. So that's just a fun little legislation quirk. I really like this slide. Now, this one is only concept design. This one has not been installed, but a lot of good thinking. Brings us back to our movement in place as well. If we look at the east-west connection here, you can see, or left to right, depending how your brain works, you can see it's multi-lane, this particular roundabout. And the wide median suggests to me it's probably a high-speed environment, and it's probably important for the movement of goods. In my mind, this is, an arterial or a motorway or something like that. So that's the east-west. The north-south, alternatively, it looks like this is a local connection into a collector road or, maybe some type of development or something. It's only a single lane and things like that. Less important from a state perspective of moving people and goods through there. So already, just that quick analysis of this site, I'm suggesting this is a movement corridor, and this, I'll just call it a local street, just for ease of reference. And that then impacts on how we treat the cyclists and vulnerable road users crossing over these legs. So for our local streets, what we've installed is we've got a raised crossing point. And we're saying, okay, motorists, you need to give way to pedestrians and cyclists crossing over here. because they are considered they're the vulnerable road users and their movement is more important than yours. Conversely, for our motorway, we actually say, you know what, it's more important that traffic get through here safely and efficiently, and cyclists, pedestrians, you need to stop, slow, wait until there's a gap in traffic before crossing over. So depending on how the classification of the road environment can impact on the treatment that you are proposing. So there you go, just an example of how the movement in place framework can tie into real design decisions. When we are looking at cycling treatments, we only really want to be seeing lane sharing where speeds are within that survivable range. So we want to see speeds at or below 30 kilometers per hour. And by lane sharing, I mean a cyclist in the traffic lane, not just off, on the side, on the shoulder or something like that, in the traffic lane. And that can be done through the use of shared arrows, for those that haven't seen that, where speeds start to get higher, 30 to 70 kilometers per hour. Relocating parking or a one-way separated bicycle lane. So that's kind of the Copenhagen bicycle lanes that we saw there before. Also, an off-road bicycle path is always appropriate. In these environments, 70 to 100, it's basically only ever appropriate to be recommending off-road bicycle paths. Even riding on the shoulder in 100 kilometer per hour roads, it's just it just takes a split second's mistake by a driver to veer out of their traffic lane, and that would inevitably result in a fatal outcome for a cyclist if they were riding on the shoulder, as opposed to if there was a separated off-road feature. So these are the things that we recommend within these environments. Acknowledge that there's a raft of issues with some of these suggestions.
Sorry, Max, just a quick one. If you could
Yeah.
go 2 slides, please.
Yeah.
Does the conflict of vehicles on different levels of road at that big roundabout become an issue, i.e. motorists coming off a higher speed movement corridor, not exactly prepared for a raised crossing so close to the exit from a movement corridor?
So I'm guessing that's coming off a high speed and then coming here and not expecting to see a raised crossing. Is that what I've interpreted? Yep.
Yes.
Wonderful. Pretty valid. I would suggest that see how they've got these bends, horizontal deflections, that's already going to start slowing vehicles down. And as they perform this radius turn into the local street there, that's already got vehicles, their foot would already be on the brake to maneuver those bends, and likely they'll be able to slow down and see those giveaway signages. If it was noted, perhaps there were sightline restrictions, you could look at putting the giveaway signage, in advance and say give way on the side road. But yeah, I think those things can generally be managed. Good question though. Thanks, Kathy. Okay. Pedestrians, similarly, we take the threshold at 30 kilometers per hour. This is an example of a prioritized crossing. Just trying to work out if that's raised or not. I think it is raised, but this is much clearer. This is a wombat crossing that's been raised and influencing our likelihood and severity, as we touched on before. Also spoke to this one before about making it easier for people in wheelchairs to be able to cross when it's all at grade for that user. So you don't have to have them going down to the carriageway level and back up to footpath level. One level for our wheelchair users. This is actually a construction site in Adelaide. Generally, this road is 60 kilometers per hour. Fun fact about South Australia, when they have a work zone, they drop down speeds to 25 kilometers an hour, which is a bit quirky. And as part of the construction work, they were doing some work on the signals here. They installed these concrete barriers. So we've just used this as an example. In a workplace setting, you know, we've identified that it's really risky to be adjacent the traffic. So we're going to reduce the speed for you, and we're going to install barriers for you because you're working away. We want you to focus on your task, etc. So speed is below that survivable limit, and you've also got a physical barrier in between you and general traffic lane. They worked away for a couple of days, did their job. As soon as they're done, speed limit goes back up to 60 and the barriers are removed. And a pedestrian can stand in the exact same position as that worker, and they do not have the same safety treatments. And you may argue that, yeah, well, the workers, they're focused on their task, and, you know, they're looking at, you know, all the bits of cabling and things like that, and focused on tools, and so they're distracted. But I guarantee you, if you're looking at this intersection and studying the people waiting to cross their lights, they're probably not focused on the traffic either. They're looking at their phone, they're reading a book, they're watching a bird in the sky, or looking at their fingernails. You know, pedestrians have the exact same level of distraction. So it's just a prime example of how we acknowledge that these risks are very real within a workplace setting, but when it's just the general public, we kind of just hope for the best. Similar type of story with tram stops. So whenever we do these, this is in Melbourne, whenever we do have these type of facilities where pedestrians need to cross over the carriageway to get to the stop, as soon as they see the tram coming, it's like the carriageway isn't there. It's like that there's just no road network whatsoever. And they just walk out straight into it and head straight over into their stop. Another perfect example of where raising those conflict points would be very advantageous. I know I've got a few more slides now, Kathy, so I might have to get stuck into these few here, but we've spoken previously about these raised intersections. Pretty sure this one's in TADS. Anyway, this one influencing likelihood and severity. So providing the vertical deflection, you're reducing speeds. Reducing speeds means you've got more time to brake and react. So it's less likely to have a collision. And also, if a collision were to occur, be less severe. Same thinking with the raised threshold. We had this similar to our crossing before, Wombat crossing. We've got this graph here, which shows our number of crashes, casualty crashes in different years over the years. And you can see between those 2 years there, there's quite a sharp decline. And that was actually when the urban default went from a 60 kilometers per hour to a 50. So that one decision has resulted in 200, 400 serious casual incidents occurring within that year. So a real indication that there is definitely a relationship between speed that we're traveling and the level of road trauma that we experience on the network. Move on to motorcyclists now, and Ken likes to talk about the 5 S's with our motorcyclist community, which is sight, surface, signs, strike, and speed. And we'll go through each of these with an example in the coming slides. Just wanted to reiterate the first 3. So sight, surface, and signs is all to do with our likelihood. So they're all L. Our strike is to do with severity, and our speed is likelihood and severity. And as I said, I will get into exactly what each of these mean now, but just wanted to foreshadow that's how we break that up into our safe system metrics. We included this just to show that there has been a little bit more recent research, so 2019, to suggest that motorcyclists perhaps shouldn't be categorized in the same vulnerable road users as pedestrians and cyclists, because they've got the leather gear and the helmet. They can survive slightly higher speeds than pedestrians and cyclists. As a general rule, though, we still tend to just, put them in the same camp as 30 kilometers per hour. That's what we'll say your survivable limit is. but we just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, there is work out there to suggest that they can survive higher speeds, but yeah, just as an FYI. First one, for the first S for motorcyclists, is to do with sight. So sight lines, being able to see motorcyclists and motorcyclists being able to see you. So this is a photo taken in time, and then a split second later, out comes the motorcyclist. So thinking about, you know, are there any obstructions that would impact sight lines? So you may think you can enter that intersection, but you didn't see that motorcyclist. So even really narrow things, even if you have clusters of, you know, signposts and things like that, if they're really close together, it can block an entire person on a bike. Same with a cyclist. So very important to consider. Surfacing is probably no surprise, but motorcyclists are generally the first in the community to tell you when there is a pothole or there's poor surfacing, and that's because, you know, they do need to lean over when they're in curves and things like that, and so they've only got 2 points of contact with the road, so they certainly feel everything. And if you are doing any rectification works, well, consider the implications of having, you know, a smooth surface on a bend for a motorcyclist, and also if there is a ramping feature to be done as well, well, how will a motorcyclist feel going over that? Will it destabilize them, for instance? Excuse me. Signs, motorcyclists generally much more in tune with signage, particularly curve warning signs and speed advisory signs going around curves. So, you know, generally as cars, you may note them as kind of advisory, but motorcyclists are likely to be more in tune with them, and it helps them to gauge the level of, you know, how strict the radius will be and things like that. So they do use this, the signage is quite important for them, which is why motorcycle routes are generally well signed with chevron alignment markers and curve warning signs. Strike, this one has to do with, okay, a motorcyclist has come off their bike or they've left the road environment. What are they going to hit? So we've actually got this little video here, and this one just shows a motorcyclist being tested against a guardrail product. So the first is being slid straight into a post, traveling at 60 kilometers per hour. That's what the test is done at, and at an angle of 25 degrees. And doesn't want to play. There we go. So that's what that kind of incident looks like, and that is definitely fatal. There's no surviving that. We can look at underrun protection, which is what this is here, which helps to dissipate that force over a length of the barrier as opposed to that blunt trauma of the post that we saw before. And that one is a survivable impact. So that underrun protection, if you haven't seen that before, is commonly applied to motorcycle routes where you've already got your W-beam or flexible guardrail barrier in place. The underrun protection, though, only reduces the severity because, you know, it's no more or less likely to happen just because it's there. It's just going to reduce the severity if a motorcyclist does crash. Hopefully it's not as severe. Oh, looks like my screen has frozen, which is great. Can you still got me there, Kathy?
Yeah, you're still there, Max, but yeah, maybe.
Oh, that's good. I'm just getting the little pinwheel, which is
Must be telling us it's time to go.
Yeah, I'm getting yeah, it's not responding now. So maybe you just want to share your screen with the LMS and I'll try and close and restart.
Yeah, no, you're good. I can just
see, this is proof this is a live webinar, huh?
Good. Where are we? Here? Take it from here.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Oh, you're able to do that. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't know you were in it. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, there's only two more slides anyway. Fantastic.
Whoopsies. No. Oh, there we go. Have you got it now? Is that better?
I've got it. Yeah, it's on the other view though. If you want to switch the presenter view. So the last S that we talk about for motorcyclists is speed, and we acknowledge that that is certainly pertinent for all road users, but particularly for motorcyclists, as they are extremely vulnerable. And this is what I was talking about with those curve warning signs, or these type of signs that tell the road users what the appropriate advised speed is with the bends. It's incredibly important for motorcyclists. So something that is regularly touched upon within that community. That was the end of the presentation. I can talk about the wire rope safety motorcyclist thing as well, or I can leave that for Ken next week, but I might just let you hop through the question first.
Do you know what we'll do is there's a couple of things that I've popped into the learning management system, and there is this most excellent, sorry, that's probably a little bit small there. Oh, that's probably a little bit big now, but anyway, untangling wire rope barriers. So this is a specific, very nice, leaflet type brochure about wire rope barriers and motorcyclists, done by our good friends over the ditch in New Zealand, but it's a great resource. There's another short document there on wombat crossing signage and some options of things we can do there, and a paper on safety of raised platforms on urban roads. There is a quiz for you to do at the end of today's session. And if you haven't already done your Module 2 assignment, please jump in there and do that. You had some great examples this morning from Henry and Anita. Thank you for sharing those. And they were two very different examples. I wanted to also go back, and in the previous session, we talked quite a bit about Surf Coast Highway, Kidman Avenue. And so there's the technical report of that one there. So that's available in there for you as well. So there's your Module 2 assignment, Module 2 quiz, if you haven't jumped in on that one just yet. Thank you very much, Max. Now, next session, Ken, with his marvellous moustache, will be back. And we are asking you to, hold on. Actually, firstly, we'll be saying goodbye to a few of the Transport for New South Wales people who are joining us for sessions 1, 2, and 3. So you are done once you've done all your quizzes and you've submitted and had your Module 2 assignment marked. So thank you very much for joining us. For those staying on, next session, we will let you know about your site visit that you're going to do, which is where you write up your Safe System Assessment report. So if you want to have a little sneak peek at this stage, and it is just a sneak peek, we have found a site for you somewhere near your home or work location, the address that you've given us, and your name is in there, so you can see where it is. Now, if there's multiple people in there and you'd like to do your assessment together, you can certainly do that. But for between now and next session, please just jump in and have a look and let me know that is, well, let me know if it's not somewhere near to where you live or work, because if it is, if you've moved or your address has changed or you find yourself in a different part of the country at the moment and you need something closer to you, please get in touch with me and let me know. So I think I've covered everything. Oh, actually, sorry. Well, there is more. Because Ken's not here, I'm accidentally going to share something. So there was a bit of chatter about wombat crossings, raised crossings, and the drainage problems. And I'm just sharing this completely because he's not here and he can't stop me from doing it. This is a little bit of a sneak peek of, 200 something slides about wombat crossings and different draining, not just 200 slides on drainage, but some different options that we have when it comes to drainage and the pros and cons of each one. But this one here, for example, is not. We don't do that one. But anyway, I just wanted to, you know, go off topic. Now, any questions or comments? Lucas said, "Oh, goody, thank you for sharing that." I'm not sure which one, but sharing it all. Any other questions or comments or?
Thanks everyone for all the good comments today, though. Kept me on my toes. And if there was anything I've said today that you would like clarified, feel free to drop me a line. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the modules or enjoy the rest of the course. And thank you very much for your participation. Have a lovely day.
Great. Thank you, Max. Thanks for filling in. See ya.
See ya. Bye.